At my brother's wedding in Dallas, with chandeliers blazing above and music soft in the air, my father lifted his glass and praised the sacrifices of our family. He promised Carter properties worth $5 million entirely to my brother. Then he turned toward me, his eyes sharp, his lips curling with triumph, and said the words that split something inside me. "You get nothing." Guests laughed nervously, and I stood frozen, carrying the weight of years, when I had paid their debts in silence, their hospital bills, their mortgage, their very survival. They never knew the daughter they dismissed was the one keeping the roof over their heads. And in that moment, surrounded by 200 witnesses, I felt the humiliation harden into resolve. That night, I would not only stop paying, I would reclaim my voice. The June heat pressed against my skin as I stepped from the car to the marble steps of the downtown Dallas hotel. A valet reached for the keys, and I let them go, palms a little damp, shoulders, set the way I had practiced in the mirror. Inside the grand ballroom, a forest of chandeliers threw small galaxies across polished floors. A jazz quartet slid through a standard, while 200 voices braided into a single bright noise. It looked like a fairy tale. It felt like a trial. I found my place near the back, a vantage point that let me see the head table and the doors at once. Michael moved through the room with a grin that never seemed to tire, shaking hands, clapping shoulders, accepting congratulations. Rachel followed close veil, tucked away the kind smile of a woman determined to be gracious to everyone in the room. People touched my elbow and said how good it was to see me. Their eyes said something softer. Poor Emily. The one who left. The one who built a life somewhere else. The band softened to a hush. My father stepped onto the small stage with a confidence that did not need the microphone and took it anyway. He looked powerful in a black suit and a bright white shirt that caught the light. He lifted his glass and welcomed everyone. He told a story about family and work and grit. He named the company he had built, Carter Properties. He named the years of long days and the commitment to a family legacy. The crowd gave him what he wanted, laughter at the right beats, a ripple of approval when he spoke about passing on what he had made. He turned to Michael, and his smile widened. He said this was the moment the torch would pass, and that Carter Properties would be placed in Michael's hands. Carter Properties, valued and steady, would belong to his son. The applause was immediate and loud. People stood. Glasses rang against glasses. Michael stared at our father as if he had been handed the sun, and then he looked at the room and took in the glow. My father turned his head and found me in the back. The smile changed. He said I would get nothing. The words were clean and sharp. They cut through the applause and it died fast. Forks stopped midway to mouths. The jazz quartet made a small mistake, and the pianist covered it with a flourish that fooled no one. Heat climbed up my neck, and then left me cold. I kept my face still, and kept my glass level, the stem tight against my fingers. I felt every look, curious, thrilled, ashamed to be thrilled, pitying, a few angry. Robert Hayes at the Business Alliance table frowned, as if checking a ledger in his head. Pastor John Reynolds leaned back and folded his hands like a man who had just witnessed a sin and was measuring the cost of speaking on it. My mother tore a linen napkin without knowing she was doing it. Her lips moved. I read the words, "Please, Richard, please do not." My father smiled at the room as if he had told a harmless joke. The room waited for me to break apart so it could move on. I did not. I set down the champagne on the nearest table. The bubbles kept rising. I took one breath and then another until my lungs belonged to me again. I could hear small voices at nearby tables. Someone asked if he really said that. Someone else said he did, and that they had always suspected there was trouble there. A cousin started toward me and stopped when I did not give her any signal to keep coming. Michael stared down into his glass. Rachel touched his sleeve and whispered to him. He took a step as if to move in my direction, and then he stopped. His eyes rose and met mine for a second, and then slid away. He did not speak. He did not smile either. That was new. My father moved on with the program as if nothing had happened. He thanked vendors and welcomed friends. He told a story about the time Michael won a school trophy and how the whole neighborhood came to cheer. People laughed. Some glanced back at me, and then quickly looked forward again. The band found its footing and eased into a tune that was meant to soothe, but the air in the room stayed tight. I walked toward the terrace doors, as if I were just going to admire the view. Outside, the city spread out in neon and glass. The air was heavy and sweet with hibiscus from the hotel planters. My reflection on the glass looked like a woman I did not know. I put both hands on the rail and let the metal cool my skin. A few seconds later, the door opened behind me. Linda stepped out and stood at my shoulder without looking at me. She said my father did not mean it like it sounded. She said the moment had swept him up. She said this was a celebration, and that she needed me to be gracious. I told her I heard him, and that I needed the air. She pressed the torn napkin into my hand, like a peace offering she could not afford, and went back inside. I stayed until my heartbeat slowed. I watched a train crawl across a bridge, a small chain of light in the dark. I thought of all the nights I had worked through to be where I was. I thought of all the times the phone rang and it was a problem only I could fix. I thought of what it costs when a family decides who matters and then performs that decision in public. The humiliation was a blow. Under it, something steadier took shape. If he could say it so easily, then he had believed it for a long time. And if he had believed it for a long time, then I had been living as if it were not true for just as long. I opened the door, and the music rolled out to meet me. The ballroom lights seemed brighter after the darkness of the terrace. I walked back to my table and sat down. Robert Hayes was watching the stage, but I could tell he was not listening. His eyes moved to me, and he gave the smallest nod. Pastor Reynolds met my gaze with a look that was not pity. It was a kind of witness. Linda wiped her cheeks with the corner of a fresh napkin and lifted her chin the way she does when she decides that a storm can be managed if no one says it is a storm. My father worked the room with the assurance of a politician at a fundraiser. He shook hands. He took congratulations on behalf of the son he had just crowned. He did not look in my direction again. A waiter asked if I wanted more champagne. I asked for water. I held the cold glass in both hands. I let conversation eddy around me, without taking me with it. The speeches resumed. The stories kept coming. I watched the small movements at the head table. Rachel glanced at Michael, and then at me, and I thought I saw worry. Michael leaned toward my father twice and then sat back without speaking. His jaw was tight. A woman in a blue dress sat beside me for a moment. She said she did not know families could be like this. I told her families could be any way they wanted when no one told them to stop. She patted my hand and left. The band leader announced that it was time to cut the cake. People moved in a cheerful wave to the far side of the room. Flashbulbs popped. The photographer called out for the Carters to gather close. I stayed seated. My chair felt like a small island, and I decided to accept the quiet. The choice calmed me. I let my breath find its rhythm. The noise around me grew soft and distant like the ocean in a shell. I traced a circle of condensation on the glass and thought about ledgers. Not the kind in my father's office, the kind I kept in my head. Every check mailed, every bill paid, every time a crisis ended because I picked up. I did not need to announce any of it. Not yet. The cake was cut, and cheers rose and fell. Rachel fed Michael a careful bite and tried to laugh when a smear of icing caught his lip. My father clapped as if he were in the front row at a gala. I set the empty water glass on the table and stood. My legs felt steady. I walked to the edge of the dance floor and stopped there close enough to be seen, if anyone chose to see me, far enough to step away if I needed the door. I caught Michael's eye again. He took a breath that looked like a first step, and Rachel touched his arm and spoke to him. He shook his head and looked back at me. Something like apology flickered there. It did not change the room. It did not change the words. It told me only that he had heard them too. The band shifted to a brighter song, and guests filled the floor. Sequins and satin moved under the lights. Waiters threaded through with trays held high. I stood still and let the celebrations surge around me like a tide around a rock. The shame settled in me heavy, but defined a thing I could see and pick up and decide what to do with. The decision did not arrive all at once. It rose in pieces. A memory of one late-night phone call, a wire transfer no one thanked me for, a hospital bill that vanished because I made it vanish. The music swelled again, and the terrace door breathed a little cool air onto the back of my neck. I knew I would sleep later and wake with every word still ringing. I also knew I would not forget the way my hands had steadied on that rail, and the way the thought had come when the lights of the city blinked against the glass. There is a ledger only I know, and it is full. I kept that ledger in my mind long before the night in Dallas. 10 years of entries, each one carved into memory, because no one else seemed willing to remember what I carried. In 2012, I was 23, standing in a rented warehouse outside Denver with nothing but 2 delivery vans, one employee who was also my cousin, and a stack of unpaid invoices. That was the birth of Carter Freight Solutions. I did not inherit a fortune or a brand, I built one. The first year I slept on a cot in the office more often than in my apartment, cold pizza balanced on boxes of shipping manifests. By 2017, we had contracts across the state. By 2022, we cleared $12 million in annual revenue. Every scar along the way was proof I had done it with my own hands. But no one in my family knew those scars the way I did. They only saw the surface. They never knew about the nights I wired money to cover bills that weren't mine. I remember the first time clearly. It was late 2016 when Mom collapsed in the kitchen. A stroke, the doctors said, caught early enough to treat, but not cheap to repair. The hospital bill came to $85,000 after insurance. Dad paced the hallways of Presbyterian Hospital, cursing deductibles, cursing the system. I did not curse. I called my banker and authorized the transfer. My mother lived, but the receipt of her survival carried my signature. 2 years later, Carter Properties, my father's empire, was about to default on a short-term note. $50,000 stood between solvency and humiliation. He called me, his voice clipped, pretending it was a temporary cash flow hiccup. I knew better. I didn't ask why. I wired the funds before dawn, then showed up to work as if nothing had happened. By the end of the month, he was shaking hands at country clubs again, the savior of his company. My name was nowhere in the story. The largest entry came in 2021. My parents' mortgage, the family home in Cherry Creek, carried an old balloon clause that suddenly came due. $120,000 due within weeks. They came to me not with thanks but with expectation. As if the daughter they called reckless was still their private bank. I paid it, the house stayed theirs, and I carried the silence of the deed. Each case sat heavy on my chest. Not just the money, but the way it was erased from memory as soon as the ink dried. My father never toasted me for saving the roof over his head. My mother never told her bridge club that the bills were paid by the daughter who was supposedly nothing. One evening in late 2021, sitting in my Denver office surrounded by contracts, I told Sophia Martinez, my attorney, everything. She had been with me since the early years drafting supplier agreements when I could barely afford her retainer. I laid out the receipts, the wire transfers, the canceled checks, the signed hospital forms. She listened quietly, her sharp eyes behind square glasses flicking through each document. When I finished, she placed the stack down and leaned back. "Protect yourself, Emily," she said. "If your father decides to cut you from his will, none of this generosity will matter. But the records will. Keep them safe. If nothing else, they prove the line between your business and theirs. You have earned your independence. Don't let them erase it." I nodded, but a knot tightened in me. It was not just about erasure. It was about betrayal. The thought that all my sacrifice could be turned into nothing more than an afterthought. Sophia gathered the papers into a neat pile, her voice firm. "You are not their safety net anymore. You are your own fortress." I drove home that night with her words echoing in my chest. The lights of downtown Denver shimmered on the windshield, but I barely saw them. The ledger in my mind had grown too heavy, and I knew one day soon I would have to decide whether to keep adding entries or close it forever. And that night, I wondered if the reckoning came, who would stand beside me when I stopped paying for their mistakes. The following morning, Sophia called me to her office downtown. Her tone on the phone had been clipped in a way that told me she was holding something back until she could look me in the eye. When I arrived, she was already standing by the window, arms folded, the skyline of Denver sprawling behind her. She did not waste time. Richard has retained a new firm, Bennett and Cole out of Houston. They specialize in estate restructuring. From the language in the filing, it looks like he intends to alter the will and transfer Carter properties solely to Michael. The words landed hard, but not with surprise. I sank into the chair across from her desk and let out a dry laugh. So it is official then. All those years of pretending I was still part of this family's future were just theater. Sophia slid a folder across the desk. This is preliminary, nothing signed yet, but you need to understand what it means. If he executes it, your name disappears from any inheritance. I tapped the folder without opening it. He already erased me in every other way. Doing it on paper is just the final performance. She sat down, leaning forward. Emily, listen to me. The money you advanced to them, the debts you covered, those were personal. Without documentation, they vanish. But you kept receipts, bank transfers, wire confirmations, checks. If you want protection, you need to consolidate and secure them. Otherwise, your father will rewrite history. I stared at the polished wood of her desk. I thought of the ledger in my head and how heavy it had grown. It was time to put it somewhere safer than memory. What do you suggest? I asked. An escrow archive, she said. I can file a secure record with a third-party custodian. No one touches it without your authorization. And I want you to sign a financial firewall. No new loans, no silent transfers. End the pipeline before he drags you into something else. The idea sat between us like a sealed door. For years I had been the back channel that kept my family afloat. Cutting it off felt like severing a vein. But the image of that ballroom in Dallas, my father's smirk as he said the words, "You get nothing," sharpened my resolve. Draw it up, I told her. She opened a drawer and pulled out a sheaf of papers. She had been ready for this moment long before I admitted it. As she explained the terms, I felt the weight shift from invisible burdens onto visible pages. Each signature I gave was a small rebellion, each initial, beside a clause, a boundary built brick by brick. When we finished, she gathered the documents into a leather folder. That is it, she said. As of today, no more money leaves your accounts for them, without a trail and without your explicit consent. You are not their bank. You are your own entity. I let out a breath I had not realized I was holding. It felt both terrifying and liberating. My whole adult life I had been defined by what I gave away. Now I was drawing a line that no one in my family had ever imagined I would. Sophia watched me closely. You understand what this means. They will notice when the pipeline stops. They will press guilt, maybe even threaten. You have to be ready to stand firm. I nodded. Let them. I am tired of being erased while paying the bill for it. On the way out of her office, I paused at the elevator folder clutched against my chest. Through the glass lobby, I could see the city moving on its own rhythm, unaware of the private war beginning inside my family. For the first time in years, I felt aligned with myself, like my steps matched the beat of my own will. That night, I locked the folder in the safe at my home office. I touched the metal door when it clicked shut, as if sealing away not just documents, but years of silence. The house was quiet. I poured a glass of water, sat at the kitchen table, and stared out at the Denver lights. The weight was shifting, but I knew storms gather fastest when supply lines are cut. The real test would not be the paperwork. It would be what happened when Richard realized the well had run dry, and when Michael understood that the sister he dismissed could no longer be used without consequence. And I wondered, as the city lights blinked against the glass, how long it would take for them to notice that the balance of power in our family had already begun to change. The clink of silver against glass carried through the ballroom as my father rose again at the head table. Guests quieted, chairs shifted, and all eyes turned to the man who loved nothing more than a stage. He lifted his champagne high and spoke about legacy, about sacrifice, about how the Carter family had always put its strength behind the son who would carry it forward. He turned to Michael and declared that every sacrifice made by this family was for him, for his success, for his future. Applause swelled as if on command. The band struck a cheerful note to fill the air. My hands curled against the linen tablecloth, steady calm, though inside I felt the familiar tightening in my chest. My father's words echoed against the walls of my silence. Sacrifice. Family sacrifice. The ledger in my mind begged to be spoken. I pushed my chair back. The sound was sharper than I intended, wood legs scraping marble. Conversations halted. My pulse thrummed in my ears, but my voice came steady. For years I paid your bills. The words sliced through the air sharp as broken glass. Faces turned. My father's smile froze. I stood tall, the years of hidden labor rising to the surface. While you celebrated your successes, I covered the debts you never admitted. I let the silence stretch, then gave the room what it did not expect. In 2016, when my mother's stroke left her in a hospital bed and the bills reached $85,000, it was not family sacrifice that paid for her care. It was me. A murmur rippled through the crowd. My mother's hand trembled on her napkin. In 2018, when Carter Properties teetered on default and $50,000 stood between you and collapse, I wired the money before dawn. My father's jaw tightened, his glass lowering an inch. In 2021, when the Cherry Creek mortgage ballooned and $120,000 threatened the roof over your heads, I paid it. Not out of obligation, but out of love. Love that was never acknowledged, never spoken of, and tonight is being erased with a smirk and a toast. I reached into my clutch and pulled out 3 folded documents, copies Sophia had insisted I carry. I held them high enough for those nearby to see. Bank transfers. Canceled checks. Not stories, not exaggerations, but proof. Whispers filled the ballroom, uneasy and sharp. Robert Hayes, seated near the front, stood slightly. His voice carried with the calm authority of a man accustomed to boardrooms. I remember that night in 2018. Richard called me frantic about the shortfall. The next day, everything was fine. He told me he had handled it, but it looks like it was Emily who saved Carter Properties. The weight of his confirmation stilled the room. My father's face darkened, but no words came. He looked at me as if I had pulled a rug from under his polished shoes. I steadied my breath. This is not sacrifice. This is silence. I have been your private bank, your shadow safety net, while being treated as if I were nothing. Tonight, I end it. Tonight, there will be no more checks, no more transfers, no more quiet rescues. The stillness in the room was suffocating. Michael's face had gone pale, Rachel's hand clutching his arm. My mother pressed her lips together, eyes wide as if begging me to sit. I felt my voice harden, every syllable a boundary carved into stone. From this moment on, I cut off every line of financial support. If my existence is worth nothing to you, then so is my money. Gasps escaped from corners of the room. Guests shifted uncomfortably, the echo of crystal glasses forgotten. My father tried to speak, but no words formed. He had built his life on control, and for once he held none. I placed the documents back into my clutch, straightened my shoulders, and stepped away from the table. The sound of my heels against the marble floor was the only noise as I crossed the room. Eyes followed me, whispers trailing in my wake. At the doorway I paused for a moment, the music silent, the air heavy. I turned my head just enough to see them all frozen in the glow of chandeliers. My voice was quieter now, but cut just as deep. You erased me in words. I erased the debt in silence. Now we are even. And then I left them to their stunned applause that never came to the hum of their own whispers, and to the realization that the daughter they had dismissed had finally walked away. The night air outside was thick with the scent of summer jasmine. I drew in a long breath, my chest lighter than it had been in years. Yet beneath the relief, a question pressed hard. In families like mine, silence never lasts long. Retaliation always comes. I wondered who would strike first. The first strike came not from my father, but from the headlines. 2 days after the wedding, the Dallas Morning Chronicle ran a feature above the fold. Patriarch snubs daughter at son's wedding, sources say she paid family's debts. The words burned black against white. They quoted unnamed guests, describing the silence that fell after my declaration, the documents I held in my hand, and Robert Hayes confirming what he had witnessed in 2018. By noon, the article had spread online. Business blogs picked it up, Gossip sites spun it for clicks, and even a local radio station ran a segment about hypocrisy in high society families. At the office, my phone vibrated with messages from colleagues forwarding links. Some wrote, "You were brave." Others sent only a single line, "Can you believe this is everywhere?" My father called that evening, voice tight with anger. "Emily, you will issue a statement clarifying that you exaggerated." His words clipped and sharp. I let the silence stretch. When I did not answer, he snapped, "Do you have any idea how much damage you have caused?" I ended the call without a word. The following Sunday, Pastor Reynolds stood at the pulpit of St. Andrew's and spoke to a packed congregation. He did not mention our name, but everyone knew. He talked about respect and dignity, about how true strength was not built on humiliating the people closest to us. He said integrity mattered more than reputation, and that family meant nothing without fairness. My mother sat in the front pew, eyes locked on the hymnal, not singing. By Monday, the whispers had sharpened into open criticism. At the Dallas Business Alliance luncheon, several sponsors cornered my father. One asked if it was true his daughter had been the real reason Carter Properties survived the 2018 liquidity scare. Another asked why the family dismissed her while living on her money. Later that day, the Alliance board issued a statement about transparency and fairness in business leadership. It was pointed enough that no one doubted who it was aimed at. Michael tried to smooth things over. He called me late one night, his voice hesitant. "They want to fix this," he said. "Just come to a private dinner, let Dad explain." I told him there was nothing to explain. Silence on the other end, then a sigh. He knew better than to push. The humiliation built quickly. My father had planned a post-wedding gala to parade the Carter name in front of potential investors. Invitations had already gone out, a lavish event at the Petroleum Club, with speeches, a chamber orchestra, and a press package ready to frame Michael as the heir of a spotless dynasty. A week before the date, the major sponsor pulled funding. They cited concerns about optics after recent reports. The cancellation spread faster than the original scandal. The Chronicle ran another piece, "Carter Family Scraps Gala," amid backlash. Editorials followed. How can we trust a man to steward millions in real estate when he cannot manage his own household with integrity? At the grocery store, strangers gave me small nods of recognition. At a cafe, a woman touched my arm and whispered, "Good for you," before hurrying away. Each moment reminded me the story was no longer private. The family ledger had become public record. My mother called in tears. She begged me to release something to calm the storm. "Please, Emily, people are saying things your father cannot show his face at the club." I listened until her voice broke, then told her softly, I was not the one who needed to explain anything. She ended the call without goodbye. The weight of silence grew heavier around the family estate. Neighbors whispered. Old friends declined invitations. Even Rachel's parents kept their distance, wary of the fallout. For once, my father had no control of the narrative. I stayed quiet. No press interviews, no public statements, only silence. Let the documents and their own behavior speak louder than I ever could. The silence became its own power. 2 weeks later, I learned my father tried to host a smaller gathering at the estate to reclaim some respect. Only half the guests arrived. One of the catering companies withdrew at the last minute, citing unpaid deposits. He stood in his own dining room with empty chairs and plates of untouched food. A photograph leaked online, my father standing stiff with a forced smile beside a half-empty banquet table. It went viral, captioned with a single line, "Family Values." The backlash was no longer contained to whispers. It became ridicule, the one thing my father could not endure. I kept working in Denver, going to my office each morning as if nothing had changed. But each time I looked at my phone, new messages poured in. Some from reporters wanting quotes, others from people I had never met, thanking me for standing up. Still, I knew this was only the beginning. Families like mine never collapse quietly. When pride is cornered, it does not retreat, it strikes back. And as the storm of gossip swirled louder each day, I braced myself for the moment my father would turn his fury directly on me. It was a Thursday morning when the knock came heavy and insistent against the glass doors of Carter Freight Solutions. My receptionist peeked around the corner, pale. "Emily," she whispered, "it is your family." I walked out into the lobby and there they were. Richard stood tall but stiff, his jaw set like stone. Linda clutched her purse with both hands, her eyes already red, as if the tears had begun before they entered the building. Behind them stood Michael, quiet, his gaze lowered to the polished floor. Richard started without pleasantries. "We need to talk about money." His voice carried across the lobby like a demand, not a request. I folded my arms. "This is not the place for theatrics. If you want to talk, we go to my office." We moved past curious employees into the glass-walled conference room. Richard did not sit. He planted his hands on the table. "Your mother has medical bills again. Costs are mounting. Insurance will not cover it. You can write a check." Linda broke, then her voice cracking. "Please, Emily. It is only temporary. Just enough to cover the treatments until we sort things out." I felt a pang, sharp but fleeting. I thought of the night years ago, when I paid that first hospital bill the way she survived, because I made sure money did not stand in the way. But the weight of silence afterward, the way no one ever acknowledged it, sat heavier now than her words. I straightened my shoulders. "You cut me off emotionally years ago. Now I cut you off financially." The words hit the air and stayed there. My father's face flushed deep red. "Do you understand what you are saying? We are your family." I met his eyes. Family does not humiliate their own in front of 200 people. Family does not erase the one who kept them afloat. You made your choice in Dallas. I am making mine here. His fist struck the table, rattling the glasses of water. "You ungrateful girl. After everything we gave you." Michael shifted then. He stepped forward quickly, a hand on Richard's arm. "Dad, stop. Not here." His voice was quiet but firm. Richard jerked away but said nothing further. Linda sobbed openly now, dabbing her eyes with a crumpled tissue. "I cannot believe you would abandon us," she said. I kept my voice calm. "I am not abandoning anyone. I am simply not paying anymore." The silence that followed was louder than any shouting. Richard breathed hard, nostrils flaring, but his words had run dry. Michael stood behind them, shoulders tense, his eyes meeting mine for the first time. There was no anger in them, only something that looked like guilt, or maybe recognition. He gave the smallest shake of his head, as if to apologize for being there at all. Then he touched Richard's arm again. "Come on, Dad. Let's go." For a moment I thought my father might explode, but he let himself be steered toward the door. Linda followed, still crying, her tissue falling to the floor behind her. I stayed standing in the conference room, spine straight, breathing steady, watching them retreat through the glass. The lobby was silent as they passed through. My employees turned away politely, but the weight of what they had seen hung in the air. Michael glanced back, once his face pale, his lips pressed tight. His eyes met mine again, and in that brief connection there was a promise of something unspoken. The door closed behind them, and the building fell back into its rhythm. Phones rang, keyboards clicked, trucks pulled away from the loading dock. But my pulse still raced. For the first time, I had not only said no, I had ended the cycle in front of witnesses. I returned to my office and closed the door. I sat behind my desk, staring at the city stretching toward the mountains. The relief was sharp, almost dizzying. But beneath it ran a new current. Michael's silence had not been loyalty to our father. It had been something else. A shift, quiet but undeniable. And I knew the next move in this unspoken war would not come from Richard's rage, but from the choice Michael was beginning to make. 3 days after the confrontation at my office, my phone buzzed with an unfamiliar number. I almost ignored it, but something in me said, "Answer." "Emily." "It is Michael." His voice was hesitant, softer than I had ever heard it. "I am in Denver. Can we talk?" I agreed to meet at a coffee shop near Union Station. The morning air was crisp, sunlight spilling across the patio tables where commuters lingered with laptops and paper cups. I saw him waiting inside, shoulders hunched, both hands wrapped around a mug that had long since cooled. He stood when I entered, then sat back quickly, as if afraid I would turn and walk out. I ordered black coffee and sat across from him. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The clatter of dishes filled the silence. Finally, he cleared his throat. "I owe you an apology." His eyes flicked to mine, then down again. "For years I convinced myself Dad was right, that you were the difficult one, that everything fell on him. But the truth is, I knew you were the one holding it together. I let him build that story because it was easier for me." I studied his face. He looked older than 32, the lines around his eyes etched deeper from weeks of stress. "You let him humiliate me," I said quietly. "You stood there and said nothing." He flinched. "I know. And I regret it more than I can explain. At the wedding I wanted to speak, but Rachel pulled me back. At your office I wanted to fight, but something in me stopped. For the first time, I saw him clearly, and I saw you." The coffee arrived. I wrapped my hands around the warm cup, steadying myself. "What do you want from me, Michael?" He reached into his bag and slid an envelope across the table. I opened it and found a copy of a service contract, the one for the wedding reception. My name was on the payment line, the deposit marked as already received. "You covered this," he said. "I know you did. Rachel and I found out when the vendor called about the balance. We will handle it from here. I am not asking you for money. I am telling you we will pay the remainder ourselves and pay you back." I stared at him. The words felt foreign coming from his mouth. "Why tell me this now?" "Because I need you to know I am finished letting Dad script my life. I want to make things right in the only way I can. It will take time, but I will pay every cent of what should never have been on your shoulders." I leaned back, measuring him. His voice was steady, his hands did not shake. This was not the Michael who basked in our father's approval. This was a man unraveling from the web he had lived in since childhood. I took a long breath. "If you are serious, then hear me clearly. There are boundaries now. No money, no guarantees, no rescuing. If you or Rachel want a relationship with me, it has to be built on respect, not on what I can pay for." He nodded quickly. "I understand. I am not here to ask for anything but the chance to prove it." For the first time in years, I saw no arrogance in him, only a quiet determination. He lifted his cup, took a slow sip, and set it down carefully. "Dad will never admit what you did. He would rather burn everything than give you credit. But I see it now. I cannot erase what I allowed, but I can stop it from continuing." I looked at the contract again, then slid it back across the table. "Then prove it." His lips curved into something halfway between relief and sorrow. "I will." We sat for a while in silence, watching strangers hurry past the windows. For once, the weight between us was not hostility, but something uncertain, maybe even fragile hope. When I stood to leave, he rose with me. "Thank you for meeting me," he said. His eyes met mine, and I could tell he meant it. Outside, the sun had risen higher, light catching on the glass towers of downtown. I walked to my car with the strange sensation that one battle line had shifted. My father's rage was predictable. My brother's awakening was not. And as I started the engine, I realized the hardest part was still to come, because my father would never forgive defiance, not from me and not from Michael. Spring turned to summer, and by June of the following year, the Carters were once again trying to polish the tarnish off their name. An invitation arrived in my mailbox, embossed with gold leaf, announcing a fundraising gala at St. Andrew's Parish Hall. The letter spoke of family unity and community support, but everyone in Denver knew it was an attempt to reclaim standing after months of ridicule. At the bottom was a personal note asking that I attend beside my parents a public show of reconciliation. I read the card twice, then set it aside. The silence in my house was steady, comfortable. I did not need a ballroom filled with whispers to know what I had already earned. 2 days later, I drafted a short statement and sent it to the parish committee. I thanked them for their work, expressed my respect for the community, and declined to appear. I wrote that I was committed to boundaries, both financial and personal, and that true respect cannot be staged. The message reached my father like a blade. He called once, his number flashing across my phone, and I let it ring. Linda wrote a brief letter that said only she understood, and for the first time, she did not beg. Michael sent a text. "I'll handle it." Reports filtered back through friends in Dallas. The gala went forward, but attendance was thin. Photographs showed Richard standing rigid behind a podium, his usual bravado dimmed. The Chronicle printed a small column noting my absence and quoting an unnamed guest who said the Carter family could not control the narrative anymore. That same week, I stood in the atrium of a downtown Denver building, microphones waiting, cameras humming. I announced the creation of the Lillian Foundation, named for my grandmother, seeded with $2 million of my own capital. Its mission was simple: to provide scholarships and seed funding for young women in logistics and supply chain management fields, where voices like mine had long been ignored. The applause that followed was not from relatives, but from colleagues, entrepreneurs, and students. I looked into their faces and felt something shift permanently. I was no longer the daughter fighting to be recognized at my family's table. I was the architect of my own. Later that month, I signed papers on a $3 million home overlooking the Denver skyline. The view stretched all the way to the mountains, clean and sharp against the evening sky. I walked through the empty rooms barefoot, my footsteps echoing on polished wood. This was the house I chose, not one inherited, not one tied to anyone else's debts. On the balcony that first night, I poured a glass of water and leaned against the rail, the city below, alive with light. I thought of my father's words in Dallas. "You get nothing." The humiliation had once burned like fire. Now it felt like a scar healed and firm, a reminder of what I had endured and why I would never go back. Family is not blood, it is respect. And I had finally stopped paying for disrespect. I let the night air fill my lungs and stood taller in the quiet. Behind me, the house waited, not heavy with history, but open to the future. Ahead, the city pulsed with possibilities I had yet to touch. Somewhere in that expanse, others were living their own reckonings, carrying ledgers like mine, waiting for the moment to close them. I knew this was not the end of the story. In families like mine, endings are rarely clean. But for the first time, I was not afraid of the next chapter. I was ready to meet it on my own terms.